The wind carried ash across the cliffs of Tsushima. Jin Sakai stood at the edge of the world he had saved, watching the sun sink into the sea. Behind him, villages rebuilt. Farmers returned to their fields. Children played without fear. The Mongol invasion had been broken, the Khan defeated, the island reclaimed. But victory had come at a price no banner could measure. Jin had abandoned the code he was born to serve. He had become the ghost, a name whispered in gratitude and terror, a shadow that killed without honor because honor alone could not save the innocent. The samurai had cast him out. His uncle, Lord Shimura, had named him traitor. The way of the warrior, the sacred path of Bushido, demanded he die with dignity rather than live with shame. But Jin had chosen a different path. He had chosen the people over the code. He had chosen survival over tradition. And now he stood alone, neither samurai nor peasant, belonging to no clan and bound by no master. The ghost was free. But freedom, he had learned, was another word for exile. He knelt on the cold stone, his katana resting across his lap. The blade was clean. The blood had been washed away, but the weight remained. Every life he had taken, every ambush he had set, every moment he had traded honor for necessity, they all lived in the steel. Jin closed his eyes and breathed. Discipline, control. These were the pillars that held him upright when everything else had crumbled. He had been taught to face death without fear, to accept the end as part of the cycle. But the end had not come. Instead, he had been given something harder. He had been given tomorrow. The sky darkened. At first, Jin thought it was only the storm that had been gathering on the horizon, the kind that rolled in from the sea and drenched the island in cold rain. But this was different. The clouds twisted, folding in on themselves, spiraling into shapes that defied nature. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made his ears ring and his chest tighten. The wind stopped. The world held its breath. And then the sky tore open. It was not lightning. It was not fire. It was a wound in reality itself, a gash of impossible color that bled light and shadow and something else, something that had no name in any language Jin knew. The rift screamed without sound, a shriek that bypassed his ears and clawed directly into his mind. He staggered, gripping his sword, his instincts screaming at him to move, to run, to fight. But there was nothing to fight. There was only the void, and it was reaching for him. Jin tried to stand. The ground beneath him shattered, not with force but with absence, as if the world itself was being erased. He fell, not down but away, pulled into the wound in the sky. His last thought before the island vanished was a single word. Discipline. He held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. He held onto it because it was all he had left. The warp swallowed him whole. It was a place without geography, without time, without the rules that governed life and death. It was an ocean of screaming souls and hungry gods, a realm where thought became reality and reality devoured thought. Jin tumbled through nightmares that were not his own, past visions of wars fought across stars he had never seen, past cities that burned with fire the color of madness. He saw faces twisted in agony, heard voices begging for mercy that would never come. And beneath it all, he felt something watching, something vast and ancient and infinitely patient. The voices whispered to him. They spoke in languages he should not understand, but somehow did. They offered him power. They promised him vengeance. They showed him visions of Tsushima in flames, of his uncle's blood on his hands, of a world where he had not hesitated, where he had embraced the darkness fully and become something more than human. They told him he could return. They told him he could rewrite his failures. All he had to do was let go. All he had to do was surrender. Jin closed his eyes. He focused on his breathing. In. Out. Steady. Controlled. The whispers grew louder, angrier, desperate. They clawed at his mind, searching for cracks, for doubts, for the shame he carried like a second skin. But Jin had lived with shame. He had walked through it, fought through it, bled through it. It was not a weakness. It was a scar. And scars were proof that you had survived. The warp could not break what had already been broken and rebuilt. It could not corrupt what had already been tested in the fire of impossible choices. Jin Sakai had become the ghost by surrendering his honor, but he had never surrendered his purpose. And that purpose, quiet and unshakable, was a light the darkness could not swallow. The voices recoiled. The visions shattered. And somewhere in the infinite chaos of the Imperium, a single soul held firm. Not because he was blessed, not because he was chosen, but because he refused to let go of the one thing that still mattered. The choice to protect. The choice to endure. The choice to be the ghost, even when no one was left to see. Time had no meaning in the warp. Jin drifted through the storm, his body weightless, his mind the only anchor he possessed. The realm around him shifted constantly, landscapes of bone and flame melting into oceans of shadow and glass. He saw towers that stretched into infinity, their surfaces carved with the screams of the damned. He saw skies that bled colors that hurt to perceive, hues that existed outside the spectrum of reality. And everywhere, always, the voices continued. They did not attack him now. They circled, patient and curious, like predators studying prey that refused to run. They whispered questions instead of promises. Why do you resist? What do you protect when there is nothing left? Do you truly believe your choices matter in a universe built on annihilation? Jin did not answer. He had learned long ago that some questions were traps. The Mongols had tried to break him with words before they tried to break him with blades. Interrogators had demanded he justify his methods, explain his betrayal, confess his sins. He had given them silence then. He gave the warp silence now. But silence was not emptiness. Jin filled the void with focus. He thought of the feel of his katana in his hand, the weight perfectly balanced, the edge honed to a whisper. He thought of the stance his father had taught him, feet planted, center low, breath steady. He thought of the discipline that had been drilled into him since childhood, the endless repetitions, the kata practiced until muscle memory became instinct. Bushido had been about more than honor. It had been about mastery, control over the self, and that control, forged over decades, was a fortress the warp could not breach. The demons came eventually. They always did. They took shapes designed to terrify, to seduce, to confuse. Some wore the faces of the Mongols he had killed, their eyes accusing, their mouths dripping blood. Some wore the face of his uncle, Lord Shimura, speaking in the voice of disappointment and duty. Some were formless, writhing masses of limbs and teeth and hunger. Jin watched them approach. He did not flinch. He did not pray. He simply stood, or floated, or existed in whatever state passed for presence in this place, and met their gaze with his own. One demon came closer than the rest. It wore the shape of a samurai, armor black as night, katana drawn and gleaming. It spoke in Jin's own voice. You abandoned everything you were. You are not a warrior. You are not a protector. You are a ghost. Empty. Hollow. Already dead. Jin tilted his head, studying the creature the way he had studied enemies on the battlefield. It was trying to wound him with truth. But truth, Jin had learned, was only as sharp as the fear behind it. He spoke for the first time since entering the warp. His voice was calm, low, steady. I chose to become the ghost. The demon hesitated. Jin continued. I did not fall into darkness. I walked into it with my eyes open. I broke the code because the code would have let innocent people die. I carry that weight. I accept it. You cannot shame me with choices I have already made. The demon snarled, lunging forward, blade raised. Jin did not move. The strike passed through him, insubstantial, meaningless. The demon dissolved into smoke, its scream fading into the roar of the warp. The others did not try again. They watched from the edges of perception, frustrated, furious, but unwilling to waste effort on a soul that gave them nothing to feed on. Jin had no faith to corrupt, no rage to inflame, no despair to harm. He was a man who had already faced the worst parts of himself and chose to keep walking. That kind of resolve, quiet and unshakable, was poison to the creatures of the Imperium. They needed doubt. They needed weakness. Jin gave them only silence and steel.
Time passed or did not pass.
Jin could not tell. He existed in a state of meditation, aware but not reactive, present but not engaged. He thought of the people of Tsushima. He thought of the farmers who had thanked him with bowed heads and trembling hands. He thought of the children who had run through the streets, laughing, free from fear for the first time in years. He thought of the cost of that freedom, the lies he had told, the allies he had sacrificed, the line he had crossed when he chose poison over honor. He had paid the price. He would pay it again. And then, without warning, the warp spat him out. Reality returned in a violent rush of gravity and pain. Jin fell, truly fell, plummeting through a sky choked with smoke and ash. He hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively, absorbing the impact across his shoulder and back. His body screamed protest. His lungs burned. But he was alive. He was whole. And beneath his hands he felt solid earth.
Real earth.
He pushed himself to his knees, gasping, and looked up. The world around him was dying. The sky was the color of old blood, lit from below by fires that stretched to the horizon. The air tasted of sulfur and rot. In the distance, Jin heard screams. Human screams. The sound of battle. The sound of people dying. He rose to his feet, one hand instinctively reaching for his katana. The blade was still there, strapped to his side, impossibly intact. Jin drew it slowly, the rasp of steel against wood a familiar comfort. He did not know where he was. He did not know how he had survived. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere nearby, people needed help. And the ghost had work to do. The planet had no name Jin recognized. Later, he would learn it was called Tertius Agraria, an agri-world in the Segmentum Obscurus, a place of endless fields and vast silos that fed a dozen systems. But when Jin arrived, it was nothing but smoke and ruin. The fields burned. The silos had been torn open, their contents spilling across the ground like the guts of slaughtered beasts. And everywhere, the dead lay in piles, their bodies twisted into shapes that defied anatomy, their faces locked in expressions of terror that transcended language. Jin moved through the wreckage like a shadow. His training took over, instinct guiding him where reason faltered. He stayed low, using the smoke for cover, his steps silent despite the rubble underfoot. He did not understand the architecture, the strange metals and plastics, the structures that towered overhead like the skeletons of gods. He did not recognize the symbols painted on walls, the sigils that dripped with something darker than blood.
But he understood the patterns of war.
He understood the difference between a battlefield and a massacre. The enemy revealed themselves soon enough. They came in groups, dressed in rags and scavenged armor, their skin marked with brands and scars. They chanted as they moved, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made Jin's skull ache.
Some carried crude blades.
Others wielded weapons that roared and spat fire, loud enough to wake the dead. They laughed as they worked, dragging civilians from hiding, cutting them down with ritualistic precision. Jin watched from the shadows, his hand tight on his katana, his breath controlled. He counted their numbers. He noted their weapons. He identified their leader, a massive figure in spiked armor, barking orders in a language Jin did not speak but somehow understood the intent behind.
Kill. Burn. Desecrate.
Jin waited until the group split.
Patience was a weapon sharper than any blade.
When 3 of the cultists broke off to search a ruined hablock, Jin followed. He moved through the debris like wind through grass, soundless, invisible. The first cultist died without knowing he had been killed, Jin's blade opening his throat in a single smooth motion. The body dropped. Jin was already moving. The second cultist turned, eyes wide, mouth opening to scream. Jin's tanto found his heart before the sound could form. The third finally saw him, raising a pistol, finger tightening on the trigger. Jin closed the distance in 2 steps, redirecting the barrel with one hand and driving his sword through the cultist's chest with the other.
Silence returned.
Jin cleaned his blades on the cultist's cloak, his movements methodical. He searched the bodies, finding nothing he recognized, but taking note of the strange devices clipped to their belts, the vials of liquid that glowed with unnatural light.
He left them untouched.
Poison was a tool, but only when you understood its nature. Jin moved on. He found the survivors huddled in the remains of a storage depot. 20, maybe 30 civilians, men and women and children, their clothes torn, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. They clutched improvised weapons, metal bars and broken tools, held in shaking hands. A few Imperial guardsmen stood among them, their uniforms stained with blood and mud, their lasguns pointed at the entrance. When Jin stepped into view, every weapon turned toward him.
He stopped, raised his hands slowly, palms open.
The universal gesture.
I am not your enemy.
One of the guardsmen barked something in a harsh, clipped language. Jin shook his head.
He did not speak their words, but he spoke the language of action.
He pointed to the cultists' bodies outside, then to himself, then made a cutting motion across his throat. The guardsmen exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with a scar bisecting his face, lowered his lasgun fractionally.
He said something quieter, almost a question. Jin nodded once. The civilians watched him with wide eyes.
A child, no older than 6, clutched her mother's leg and stared. Jin met her gaze and allowed himself the smallest smile. It was the same smile he had given the children of Tsushima, the one that said, "You are safe now." The child did not smile back, but her grip on her mother loosened, just a little.
Outside, the chanting grew louder.
The cultists were regrouping, gathering for another sweep. Jin turned toward the entrance, his hand on his katana. The scarred guardsman stepped forward, speaking urgently, gesturing for Jin to stay back, to hide with the others.
Jin shook his head. He did not have the words to explain, so he showed them instead.
He walked out into the open, into the firelight and the smoke, and the cultists saw him. For a moment they hesitated, confused by the sight of a single man in strange armor, carrying a sword that gleamed like moonlight. Then their leader roared, and they charged. Jin waited.
He counted heartbeats.
He measured distance.
And then he moved.
The ghost did not fight like the Imperium soldiers. He did not stand his ground and trade blows. He flowed, shifting between enemies like water through cracks, his blade finding throats and hearts and tendons with surgical precision. He used their numbers against them, drawing them into tight spaces where their weapons were useless, where their rage made them clumsy. He struck from shadows and vanished before they could retaliate. He turned their fear into a weapon, each death amplifying the uncertainty of the next target. The cultists broke. They scattered, running into the smoke, abandoning their ritual, their purpose forgotten in the primal need to escape. Jin did not pursue. He had learned long ago that fear was as effective as steel when applied correctly. He returned to the depot, his breathing steady, his armor barely marked. The guardsmen stared at him like he was a legend stepped out of ancient history. The civilians whispered among themselves, the word spreading even though Jin could not understand it.
Ghost.
The word was the same in any language. A name for something that should not exist but does. A name for hope when hope should be dead. Jin cleaned his blade and sheathed it. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply looked at the scarred guardsman and gestured toward the horizon, toward the distant glow of what might be a safer zone, a rallying point, a chance. The guardsman understood. He began organizing the civilians, preparing them to move. And as they gathered their meager belongings and took their first steps toward survival, Jin slipped back into the shadows.
There were more cultists.
More people in danger. The ghost had work to do. And this world, whatever it was, would learn what it meant when a samurai chose to fight not for honor, but for the innocent. The Inquisition arrived 3 days after the cultists had been driven back. Their ship descended through the ash-choked sky like a black cathedral, bristling with weapons and sanctified armor. its hull inscribed with prayers that burned with pale fire. Jin watched from a distance as armored figures disembarked, their presence commanding immediate submission from the Imperial forces. The guardsmen who had fought beside him, who had survived because of him, fell to their knees. Jin remained standing. The Inquisitor was a woman clad in crimson and gold, her face hidden behind a mask of polished silver. She moved with absolute authority, her retinue fanning out behind her, servo skulls hovering at her shoulders, their mechanical eyes recording everything. She surveyed the survivors, the ruins, the bodies of cultists piled and burned. And then her gaze found Jin. She stopped. For a long moment she simply stared. Then she spoke a single word, and her retinue moved to surround him. Jin did not resist. He had learned to recognize power structures, even when he did not understand their origins. These were the authority here, the equivalent of lords and magistrates. They would have questions. He would answer what he could. The retinue escorted him aboard the ship, through corridors lined with statues of stern-faced saints and walls covered in scripture. Jin read none of it, but he felt the weight of it, the oppressive certainty that radiated from every surface. This was a culture built on belief, unshakable, absolute, and merciless. They brought him to a chamber lit by candles and filled with the scent of incense. The Inquisitor sat across from him, flanked by two figures in robes, their eyes glowing with unnatural light. Psychers. Jin had no word for what they were, but he felt their attention like pressure against his skull. The Inquisitor spoke in Gothic, her voice cold and measured. Jin met her gaze and replied in his own language. "I do not understand you." One of the Psychers stepped forward, placing a hand on Jin's forehead. He tensed but did not pull away. The Psycher's eyes flared, and suddenly the words made sense. Not translated, but comprehensible, as if the meaning bypassed language entirely. The Inquisitor spoke again. "Who are you?" Jin answered simply. "A protector." The Psyker relayed his response. The Inquisitor leaned forward. "You killed servants of chaos without prayer or blessing. You fought demons without faith in the Emperor." "How?" Jin considered the question. How did one explain discipline to those who valued only devotion? How did one justify survival when survival itself seemed to require something beyond will? He spoke slowly, carefully. "I was trained to face death, to remain calm when others panic, to act when action is needed. The cultists were enemies. I stopped them." The Psyker's eyes flickered. The Inquisitor's mask betrayed no emotion, but her voice sharpened. "You carry no mark of chaos, no taint, no corruption. Yet you exist outside the Emperor's light. This is not possible." Jin said nothing. The Inquisitor rose, circling him like a predator. "You are an anomaly, a weapon without a master, a soul that resists the warp through force of will alone. The Imperium has no place for such things. You will kneel. You will accept the Emperor's blessing. You will serve, or you will be purged." Jin looked up at her, his expression calm. "I will not kneel to gods I do not know. I will not fight for empires I do not serve. But I will help those who need it. If that makes me your enemy, then do what you must." The chamber fell silent. The Psychers exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy. The Inquisitor stared at Jin for a long moment. Then she laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You are either a saint or the most dangerous heretic I have encountered. I have not decided which." She gestured, and the retinue stepped back. "You will be watched. You will be tested. And if you falter, if you show even a trace of corruption, I will end you myself. Do you understand?" Jin nodded once. The Inquisitor turned away, her cloak sweeping behind her. "Take him to the surface. Let him continue his work. We will see what he truly is." Jin was escorted back to the planet, returned to the ruins and the survivors. The guardsmen who had fought beside him kept their distance now, their eyes wary. They had been told he was under inquisitorial scrutiny, that he was suspect, that his help, while effective, was not to be trusted. Jin did not blame them. Trust was earned through time, and time was a luxury in a war zone. He gathered his belongings, checked his weapons, and moved on. There were more people in danger.
More cultists to stop. More lives to save.
The Inquisition could watch. They could judge. But they could not stop him from doing what he had always done. The ghost did not need permission to protect the innocent. He never had. As he disappeared into the smoke-filled wasteland, the scarred guardsman who had first lowered his weapon watched him go. Under his breath, he whispered a prayer, not to the Emperor, but to the silent warrior who had saved them all.
Let him walk in shadows. Let him strike unseen.
Let him be the ghost we need, even if the Imperium does not deserve him. The words were heresy. But in that moment, the guardsman did not care. He had seen what devotion without compassion looked like. He had seen what the Imperium's doctrine produced. And he had seen something else.
Something rarer.
A man who fought not because he was ordered to, but because it was right. That kind of heresy, the guardsman thought, might be the only thing worth believing in. The warbands came hunting. Word had spread through the corrupted Vox networks and whispered pacts made in blood-soaked temples. A lone warrior, untainted and unyielding, was loose on Tertius Agraria. The Chaos Lords saw him as an insult, a challenge, a prize waiting to be claimed. They sent kill teams, each one more vicious than the last, expecting to return with his head and the glory that came with breaking the unbreakable. None of them returned at all. Jin learned their patterns quickly. Chaos thrived on spectacle, on grand gestures and overwhelming force. They announced their presence with fire and screaming, with demonic summonings and chanted curses. They wanted their enemies to know they were coming, to feel the despair, to break before the battle even began. Jin used that arrogance against them. While they marched through the ruined streets, proclaiming their dark devotion, Jin was already behind them, cutting supply lines, poisoning water stores, setting traps in the places they would inevitably camp. The first warband lost half its number to a collapsed hab block. Jin had spent hours studying the structure, identifying the weakened support beams, the places where a single precise strike could bring tons of rubble down. He waited until they gathered inside, celebrating a minor victory, drunk on stolen amisic and bloodlust. Then he cut the beam. The building fell. The screams were brief. Jin moved on before the dust settled. The second warband fell to their own weapons. Jin infiltrated their camp under cover of darkness, moving between tents with the silence that had made him a legend on Tsushima. He found their ammunition stores, their stockpiles of grenades and explosives, carefully blessed by dark priests and primed for maximum destruction.
Jin did not sabotage them.
He simply rearranged them, placed them where careless footsteps would trigger chains of catastrophic detonation. When the warband woke and began their morning rituals, the first explosion ignited a cascade. By the time the fires died, there was nothing left but scorched earth and ash. The third warband was led by a champion of Khorne, a towering brute clad in brass and bone, wielding a chain axe that screamed with the voices of the damned. He challenged Jin openly, bellowing into the smoke-filled sky, demanding single combat, promising a warrior's death. Jin watched from a rooftop 300 meters away. He had no interest in honor duels with monsters. He drew his bow, an elegant weapon he had recovered from a fallen guardsman's pack, modified with the instincts of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of the ambush. He nocked an arrow, adjusted for wind and distance, and released. The arrow took the champion through the eye slit of his helmet. The demon-forged armor could not save him. The champion fell, his axe clattering to the ground, his warband staring in stunned silence. Jin fired 3 more arrows in rapid succession, each one finding a lieutenant, a bannerman, a priest. The warband broke, not because they feared death, but because they could not comprehend an enemy who refused to engage on their terms. Chaos valued strength, fury, the clash of gods and mortals. Jin gave them only distance and precision. They had no answer for it. The underhives became his domain. The sprawling labyrinth of tunnels and abandoned infrastructure beneath the planet's surface was a maze to the warbands. a place where their numbers meant nothing and their blessings could not protect them. But to Jin, it was familiar ground. He had fought in the forests and villages of Tsushima, places where terrain was a weapon and patience was armor. The underhives were no different. He learned the passages, the choke points, the places where sound carried and the places where it died. He set traps with scavenged mines and tripwires. He poisoned the water sources the cultists relied on, using toxins he distilled from the planet's own polluted ecosystem. He left no trace, no pattern, nothing the enemy could predict or counter. The cult leaders began to fear him. Interrogations of captured cultists revealed whispered conversations, rumors that spread like disease. The ghost had returned. Not the heroes of the Imperium, not the saints and champions whose names were carved into history. The ghost. A figure from nightmares, silent and unstoppable, who killed without mercy and vanished without trace. Some cultists claimed he was a demon himself, sent by rival gods to mock their faith. Others believed he was a weapon forged by the Imperium's darkest secrets. None of them guessed the truth, that he was just a man who had already sacrificed everything and had nothing left to lose. Jin did not revel in the fear he inspired. He did not take pride in the body counts or the disrupted rituals. He simply continued. Every warband he crippled was one less threat to the civilians struggling to survive. Every cult leader he eliminated was one fewer voice commanding atrocities. The work was endless. The enemy was infinite. But Jin had learned long ago that victory was not measured in finality. It was measured in the lives saved today, the innocents who lived to see tomorrow.
That was enough.
One night, he returned to the depot where he had first saved the guardsmen and civilians. It was empty now, long evacuated to safer zones. But someone had left a marker, a crude painting on the wall in faded red pigment. It showed a figure in armor, a sword raised against the darkness, and beneath it, a single word in Gothic. Jin could not read the language, but he understood the intent.
Hope.
He stared at the image for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into the shadows. Across the planet, the warbands continued to hunt him. But now, when they chanted their dark prayers and called upon their gods for strength, there was a hesitation in their voices.
A flicker of doubt.
Because somewhere in the smoke and ruin, the ghost was waiting. And chaos, for all its power and corruption, was learning a lesson it had not faced in millennia. That resolve, quiet and unshakable, could be more terrifying than any demon. That a man who refused to break, who refused to surrender, who refused to let go of his purpose, could wound the inevitable itself. The warbands learned.
But they learned too late.
And the ghost continued his work, one precise strike at a time, proving that even in a universe built on annihilation, discipline and determination could still draw blood. They arrived like thunder given form, drop pods screaming through the atmosphere, slamming into the earth with impacts that shook the ground for kilometers. The Black Templars had come to Tertius Agraria, summoned by inquisitorial request, tasked with purging the chaos infestation and reclaiming the planet in the Emperor's name. They were giants, each one a transhuman warrior clad in ceramite painted black and white, adorned with chains and purity seals and skulls taken from vanquished enemies. They were the Imperium's wrath incarnate, and they expected no resistance from anything mortal. Jin watched their deployment from the ruins of a processing plant. He had heard the guardsmen speak of space marines in tones of reverence and fear, describing warriors who could not die, who knew no doubt, who served the Emperor with fanatical devotion. Jin studied them now with the eyes of a tactician. They moved with purpose, their formations disciplined, their communication efficient. They were dangerous. He made note of their weapons, the roaring chainswords and bolters that spat explosive rounds. He observed their patterns, the way they cleared buildings, the protocols they followed. And then he returned to his own work. The Black Templars encountered him during a sweep of the eastern sectors. A squad of 5 Astartes, led by a sword brother named Adelmar, had cornered a group of cultists in an abandoned shrine. The cultists were well-armed, desperate, and fanatical, willing to die rather than surrender. The Black Templars prepared to storm the position, their doctrine demanding direct assault, faith over caution.
And then the cultists began to fall.
One by one they dropped, each death swift and silent.
Adelma raised a fist, halting his squad.
They scanned the area, auspexes searching for threats, but found nothing. The last cultist collapsed, a blade wound across his throat, his weapon still in his hands. The Black Templars advanced cautiously, entering the shrine with bolters raised. They found the bodies.
They found no attacker.
And then a voice spoke from the shadows, calm and low. They were going to kill hostages. The Black Templars turned as one, weapons trained on the source. Jin stepped into view, his katana sheathed, his hands open and empty. He was smaller than any of them, his armor primitive by their standards, his weapons laughably inadequate compared to their holy war gear. But Adelmar did not fire. He stared at Jin, his helm's optics analyzing, processing. Behind Jin, huddled against the shrine's wall, were a dozen civilians, wide-eyed and trembling, alive because someone had reached them first. Adelmar lowered his bolter fractionally. He spoke in Gothic, his voice a deep rumble filtered through his helm's vox.
"Who are you?"
Jin met his gaze. He did not speak the language perfectly, but the Psyker's gift still lingered, allowing comprehension if not fluency.
"A protector."
Adelmar tilted his head. "You are the one the Inquisition watches."
"The anomaly."
Jin nodded once. Adelmar was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured to his squad.
"Secure the civilians. Prepare for extraction."
The Black Templars moved to obey, their efficiency undimmed. Adelma remained, studying Jin. "You fight without faith."
"Without the Emperor's blessing."
"How do you stand against chaos?"
Jin considered the question.
"The same way I stood against invaders on my homeland.
With discipline, with purpose,
with the choice to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Adelmar's helm betrayed no expression, but his posture shifted, a subtle acknowledgement. "You speak of duty." Jin nodded. "I speak of what must be done." Adelmar was quiet. Then he spoke again, his tone softer, almost contemplative. "We are taught that faith is the shield against corruption. That only through the Emperor can humanity endure. Yet you endure without him. This troubles my brothers." Jin looked at the civilians being shepherded to safety by the Black Templars.
"And yet your brothers save them, the same as I do. Does the reason matter if the result is the same?"
Adelmar stared at him. For a long moment, the Sword Brother said nothing. Then he turned, gesturing for Jin to follow.
"Walk with us.
The Inquisition may name you suspect, but I will not strike down a warrior who fights beside us, not while innocents still draw breath." Jin inclined his head, a gesture of respect, and followed. The extraction was tense. The Black Templars moved as a unit, their presence a wall of ceramite and firepower that deterred the scattered cultist bands. Jin moved alongside them, his role unspoken but understood. He covered angles they could not, slipped through spaces too narrow for their bulk, scouted ahead, and reported back with gestures and brief words. The Black Templars adapted, incorporating him into their formation without ceremony. They did not trust him, but they respected competence. And Jin was undeniably competent. When they reached the extraction point, a Thunderhawk descending to retrieve the civilians and wounded guardsmen, Adelmar stopped Jin with a raised hand. "You will not join us."
Jin shook his head. "There is more work here."
Adelmar nodded slowly. "The Inquisition believes you are dangerous. That a man without faith is a man one step from damnation."
"I do not know if they are wrong, but I know that you fought when others fled.
You saved lives when you could have walked away. That is not the behavior of the damned."
"That is the behavior of a warrior."
Jin met his gaze. "Your people have a word for what I am."
"Heretic."
Adelmar did not deny it.
"They do."
He paused. "But we also have a word for those who stand when all hope is lost."
"We call them brothers."
He extended a gauntleted hand. Jin stared at it for a moment, then gripped it firmly. The gesture transcended language, transcended culture. Two warriors, separated by galaxies and philosophies, united by the simplest and oldest truth: that those who can fight have a duty to protect those who cannot. Adelma released his grip and boarded the Thunderhawk. As the craft lifted off, Jin watched it disappear into the smoke-stained sky.
He did not know if he would see the Black Templars again.
He did not know if their respect would shield him from the Inquisition's judgment. But for a moment, standing in the ruins of a world at war, he felt something he had not felt since leaving Tsushima. Recognition.
Not as a ghost, not as a heretic,
But as a warrior. And that, however fleeting, was enough. The order came without warning. Jin was sheltering with a group of survivors in the remnants of a factory complex when the Vox broadcasts began, crackling through the guardsmen's damaged equipment. All Imperial personnel were to evacuate immediately. All civilians were to report to designated extraction zones. Tertius Agraria had been declared irredeemable. Exterminatus would commence in 72 hours. The planet would burn. Nothing would remain. Jin did not understand the word, but he understood the panic. The guardsmen began shouting, scrambling to gather supplies, to organize the civilians for transport. One of them, a young woman with a bandaged arm, tried to explain in broken sentences and frantic gestures.
The Inquisition had decided. Too much corruption. Too many cultists. The planet was lost.
They would destroy it from orbit.
Everyone had to leave. Now.
Jin looked at the civilians. There were hundreds of them scattered across the region, hiding in ruins, clinging to survival. The designated extraction zones were kilometers away, through territory still infested with chaos warbands. Many were injured, sick, or too young to make the journey quickly. The 72-hour window was not mercy. It was a death sentence dressed as procedure. Jin turned to the guardsman.
How many can you evacuate?
The scarred veteran, the one who had first trusted Jin, shook his head grimly.
Maybe a quarter, if we're lucky.
If the cultists don't hit the convoys.
If the ships have room.
Jin's expression hardened.
And the rest?
The veteran looked away. The Imperium does not leave worlds half-cleansed. If they stay, they burn.
It is the Emperor's will.
Jin stared at him. The Emperor is not here.
I am.
The veteran flinched. The other guardsmen exchanged uneasy glances. Jin continued, his voice calm but unyielding. You will take as many as you can to the extraction zones.
I will buy you time.
I will clear the routes. I will hold the lines the cultists will try to collapse. And when the ships are full, you will make sure they launch. Do you understand? The veteran nodded slowly.
And you?
What will you do when the ships are gone? Jin did not answer. He simply checked his weapons, tightened the straps on his armor, and walked toward the door. The veteran called after him.
You cannot save them all.
Jin stopped, glancing back.
No. But I can save more than none. And that is enough.
He disappeared into the smoke before anyone could argue. The next 72 hours were a crucible. Jin moved faster than he ever had, pushing his body beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, into the realm of pure will. He scouted convoy routes, marking safe passages and eliminating ambush points. He cleared collapsed roads, using scavenged explosives to blast through rubble. He fought running battles with cultist warbands, drawing them away from civilian columns, leading them into traps where their numbers became liabilities. He did not sleep. He did not stop. Every minute saved was another life that might reach the extraction zones. The convoys moved under his protection, long lines of refugees and wounded soldiers trudging through the ash. Jin was everywhere, a shadow that appeared when cultists attacked, vanishing before gratitude could be spoken. He became a rumor, a legend, a ghost in truth. The civilians whispered his name like a prayer. The guardsmen followed his lead without question, their doubt eroded by the sheer weight of his actions. And slowly, impossibly, the evacuation accelerated. But the Inquisition kept its schedule. As the 72nd hour approached, the ships began to depart, their holds packed with survivors, their engines roaring as they climbed toward the fleet waiting in orbit. Jin stood on a ridge overlooking the final extraction zone, watching the last transports lift off. He had done the math. Roughly 60% of the region's survivors had made it aboard. Better than the quarter the veteran had predicted. Not enough. Never enough. He turned to find the scarred veteran standing behind him, his uniform scorched and torn, his face drawn with exhaustion. "The Inquisitor has ordered us to leave."
"Now."
Jin nodded.
"Go."
The veteran hesitated.
"Come with us. There is nothing left here."
Jin looked out over the dying world, the fires spreading unchecked, the sky darkening as the fleet prepared its bombardment. "There are still people out there."
"Hiding."
"Hoping."
"I can find them."
The veteran shook his head.
"You have hours.
Maybe less." "You will die." Jin turned to face him, his expression calm. "I chose to be the ghost so others could live. That choice does not end, because the odds are impossible."
"It ends when there is no one left to save."
The veteran stared at him, something breaking behind his eyes. He saluted, a crisp, formal gesture, the kind reserved for heroes. Then he ran for the last transport. Jin watched it leave, its engines flaring, lifting into the poisoned sky.
He was alone.
He turned and ran back into the wasteland. There were scattered groups still out there, families hiding in the deep underhives, wounded guardsmen too slow to reach extraction, children separated from parents in the chaos. Jin found them one by one, leading them toward secondary shelters, old mining tunnels deep enough that they might survive the initial bombardment. It was a desperate hope. But hope was all he had left to give.
The fleet fired as the last hour expired.
The sky split open, lances of light piercing the clouds, striking the surface with the force of dying stars. The planet screamed. The ground shattered. Firestorms erupted, consuming everything in their path. Jin ran through the inferno, carrying a child on his back, shielding an elderly man with his body, pulling survivors into the tunnels as the world ended above them. The heat was unbearable.
The noise was deafening.
And through it all, Jin held on to the one thought that had carried him through every impossible moment.
One more.
Just one more. When the bombardment ceased, the tunnels were silent. Jin lay in the darkness, his body broken, his armor scorched, his breath shallow. Around him, the survivors he had saved huddled together, weeping, praying, alive.
He had not saved them all.
He had not even saved most.
But he had saved these.
And in a universe that demanded obedience over compassion, protocol over mercy, that act of defiance, small and insignificant against the scale of the Imperium's cold machinery, was a victory. The ghost closed his eyes. And for the first time in days he allowed himself to rest. Jin did not die in the tunnels. The survivors pulled him from the rubble, tended his wounds with scavenged medical supplies, shared their meager rations until his strength returned. When rescue ships finally arrived, drawn by distress beacons activated in the deep shelters, they found not just scattered refugees, but a community held together by the memory of a silent warrior who had refused to abandon them. Jin slipped away before the Inquisition could arrive, disappearing into the chaos of refugee processing, becoming just another nameless survivor among thousands.
But his legend did not disappear. It spread.
Guardsmen who had fought alongside him told stories in the barracks, whispered accounts of a warrior who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Refugees carried his name to other worlds, painting crude symbols on walls, the image of a ghost standing against the dark. The ecclesiarchy condemned the iconography as heretical, but they could not stop it. And Jin, whether he knew it or not, had become something dangerous.
A symbol. Proof that faith was not the only shield against the horror of the galaxy.
He moved from war zone to war zone, never staying long, never seeking recognition. He learned the Imperium's languages through immersion and necessity. He adapted to the weapons and tactics of this era, scavenging gear from battlefields, modifying equipment with the ingenuity born of desperation. His katana remained his primary weapon, its edge still impossibly sharp, but he learned to use las guns and bolt pistols when stealth gave way to open combat. He became a hybrid, a warrior of two worlds, carrying the discipline of Tsushima into the endless wars of the 41st millennium. Chaos marked him. The dark gods could not ignore a soul that continued to resist, that wounded their servants and disrupted their rituals without the protection of faith or corruption. They sent champions after him, warriors blessed with demonic strength, psychers who could tear reality apart with a thought. Jin faced them with the same calm he had shown the Mongol Khans. He studied their patterns. He exploited their arrogance. He turned their power into weakness, drawing them into environments where mortal cunning outweighed supernatural might. And one by one they fell. A Sloneshi champion, who had boasted of claiming 1,000 skulls for the Dark Prince, died in an abandoned hive spire, his throat cut by a blade he never saw coming. A Nurgle sorcerer who had spread plague across 3 systems, burned in a chemical fire Jin ignited using the very toxins the sorcerer had cultivated. A Tsenenkian warlock who foresaw every possible future, failed to account for the man who did not rely on prophecy but on discipline, whose actions were not dictated by fate but by choice. The warlock's last vision was of a blade piercing his heart, and the realization that some things could not be predicted because they should not exist. The warp itself recoiled, not in fear but in frustration. Jin was an anomaly, a variable that defied the dark gods' understanding. He had no faith for them to corrupt, no ambition for them to twist, no despair for them to harvest. He was a void in their calculations, a blank space where their influence simply stopped. And that void, spreading across war zones and whispered about in cultist gatherings, became a wound in the certainty of chaos.
A reminder that the galaxy was not theirs alone.
Jin did not seek the warp, but the warp sought him. He found himself drawn, whether by chance or design, to the edges of reality, to places where the veil was thin and demons bled through into the Imperium. He walked into corrupted temples and emerged with civilians who should have been lost. He infiltrated cult strongholds built on demonic foundations and collapsed them from within, using mundane explosives and patience to unravel rituals that had taken years to construct. He did not banish demons with prayer. He simply made the environments they required unsustainable, cutting off their anchors, disrupting the belief that gave them form. The Imperium did not know what to do with him. Reports reached the highest levels, accounts too consistent to dismiss, describing a lone warrior who operated outside the chain of command, who refused all honors, who saved lives the Imperium had written off as acceptable losses.
Some called for his capture.
Others called for his sanctification. The debate raged in distant chambers while Jin continued his work, indifferent to the politics of empires and gods. On the world of Krevast, he saved an entire refugee convoy from a demonic incursion, holding a collapsing bridge long enough for 10,000 civilians to cross. On Voltara Prime, he assassinated a cult leader moments before a ritual that would have torn open a warp rift large enough to swallow the planet. On Hadrian's Reach, he walked into a besieged Medici station and held the perimeter alone for 14 hours, buying time for evacuation ships to arrive. Each act was small in the scope of galactic war. Each act was everything to the people he saved. Soldiers began to whisper a new doctrine, unsanctioned and heretical. That courage did not require fanaticism. That honor could exist without gods. That a man armed with discipline and resolve could stand against the darkness not because he was blessed, but because he chose to. The whispers spread. And in a galaxy drowning in despair, where hope was rationed and mercy was weakness, those whispers became something rare and precious.
They became belief, not in the Emperor, not in chaos,
but in the idea that individual choice still mattered.
That one person standing firm could change outcomes.
Jin never heard the doctrine spoken in his name. He never saw the shrines built in hidden places, where his image was carved not as a saint but as a reminder.
He only knew the work, the next war zone,
the next group of people in danger. The next line he would hold because no one else was there to hold it. And that work, endless and impossible, was enough. Because the ghost had never fought for recognition. He had fought because the alternative was to let innocent people die. And that, in the end, was the only choice that mattered.
Years passed, or perhaps decades.
Time had little meaning to Jin anymore. He measured his life not in days but in lives saved, in battles fought, in moments where the impossible became merely difficult. His body bore the scars of 1,000 conflicts, wounds that would have killed lesser men, but which he endured through sheer discipline and refusal to stop. His armor was a patchwork of scavenged materials, Imperial gear modified with techniques from a world no one in this galaxy remembered. His katana remained, its edge still sharp, a reminder of who he had been and who he chose to remain.
The Imperium stopped hunting him, not out of acceptance, but pragmatism.
The Inquisition maintained files, kept watch, but interfered less. Some inquisitors had come to a quiet conclusion. That Jin Sakai was a weapon pointed at the right enemy, and that redirecting him would cost more than allowing him to continue. Others believed he was a test sent by the Emperor himself to challenge the Imperium's faith. Jin did not care what they believed. He simply continued. He refused every offer of command. Generals approached him, promising ranks and resources, armies to lead and wars to win. Jin declined them all. He was not a leader of empires. He was a protector of individuals. The people who fell through the cracks of the Imperium's vast machinery. The refugees and survivors who were statistics and reports but flesh and blood on the ground. Those were the people Jin fought for.
And they did not need a general. They needed a ghost.
He refused titles. Sainthood was proposed more than once, the ecclesiarchy attempting to canonize him, to fold his legend into their doctrine. Jin rejected it with the same calm he rejected everything else that sought to define him. He was not a saint. He was a man who had made choices, some of which still haunted him. The civilians he had failed to save. The battles he had lost. The moments where discipline had not been enough. Those failures were not washed away by success. They were carried, a weight that kept him grounded, that reminded him why he continued. He became a wanderer. A figure who appeared in the worst war zones, where the fighting was most desperate and the casualties most severe. He would arrive without announcement, fight without coordination, and vanish before official reports could be filed. Guardsmen learned to recognize the signs. Cultists found dead in ways that defied explanation. Civilians rescued from situations deemed hopeless. Equipment sabotaged with surgical precision. The ghost had been there. And for a brief moment, the impossible had been survived. The legends grew. Some said he was immortal, blessed by powers beyond comprehension. Others claimed he was a demon himself, bound by ancient pacts to fight other demons. A few, the ones who had actually seen him, who had fought beside him or been saved by him, knew the truth.
He was a man. Just a man.
But a man who had chosen discipline over despair, action over resignation, protection over self-preservation. And in a galaxy where gods and monsters walked, that choice, simple and human, was the most powerful weapon of all. Jin stood on the edge of a battlefield, watching the sun rise over a world that had survived the night. Behind him, refugees boarded evacuation ships, their faces hollow but alive. Guardsmen tended their wounded, their voices tired but relieved. The war was not over.
It would never be over.
But today, these people had tomorrow.
And that was enough.
He turned and walked into the wasteland, his silhouette fading into the morning light. There were other wars. Other worlds. Other people who needed a ghost. The Imperium would continue its endless crusade, its doctrine of faith and fire. Chaos would continue its corruption, its promise of power and damnation. And somewhere between them, in the margins and shadows, Jin Sakai would continue his own war.
Not for glory, not for gods,
but for the simplest and oldest reason. Because people needed help. Because he could provide it. Because the choice to protect, to endure, to stand when others fell, was the only choice that had ever mattered to him.
The ghost had no home, no master, no empire. But he had purpose.
And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, where mercy was heresy and compassion was weakness, that purpose was a light the darkness could not extinguish. Not because it burned brighter than the horrors of the galaxy, but because it refused to go out.
One life at a time,
One battle at a time.
one choice at a time.
The ghost walked on, and the Age of Ash learned what Tsushima had learned centuries before. That honor, true honor, was not about codes or gods or empires. It was about the moment you chose to stand, even when standing was impossible. Even when no one would see. Even when the only reward was knowing you had tried. Jin Sakai had made that choice long ago, and he would make it again for as long as breath remained in his body. The ghost endured,
And that was enough.